All right, settle down. Thanks, guys. Super cool to be here at Big Omaha. It's funny because this name, Big Omaha, is a little bit redundant for me. Omaha just is synonymous with big for me. Seriously, growing up, I grew up 100 miles west of here in this town called Clarks. It's one of those towns every 10 miles on Highway 30. And you know the ones, population 300 to 400. Actually, I grew up outside the town on that farm in the middle of the screen there. The field to the west of that farm, that was one of those I was in charge of irrigating for a few years. Here's me and my little sister on our hand-me-down John Deere bikes. That was my brother's bike that I have. You can see I modded it a little bit. Got the BMX handlebars and grips on there. Still got the banana seat. I moved that off later, and the frame is welded, as you can see, probably from some of my jumping. That shed in the back, I actually jump off that shed with my bike. Not on the tall side, on the short side. So that's where I'm from, and growing up there, actually, Omaha was a really big city. It was terrifying. I didn't come here that often, and it was a long way away from Clarks, but not as far as San Francisco, which is where I live now. It's kind of cool, by the way, that you can get on I-80 and drive directly into San Francisco. That's just a fun fact, but did that a couple times. Today I want to tell you a few things about that journey, not actually the drive, but the journey between here and today. So the story I'll start with is starting 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I'm in Grand Island, Nebraska. I go to the Conestoga Mall. Right on. It's where we got all our duds. But I actually was going to the bookstore, and I walked in the bookstore, and I browsed the magazine rack, as I often did. And I was kind of into computers at this time. I wasn't a programmer, although I did that in high school and really loved it. At this time, I was an excellent Windows 3.1 user. I mean, I had that shit down. Sometimes I'd jump into the DOS shell, even. So I walk up to the magazine rack, and I'm perusing the computer magazines, and there's one that jumps out at me. It looked different than all the others. It didn't have a computer on the front, for one thing. It had these neon colors and futuristic fonts, and that was the second ever issue of Wired magazine. And this was in 1993. I picked up the magazine, and I was flipping through it, and I was like, this is interesting, and I took it home, and I just started devouring it, and I was mesmerized because I was a little bit familiar with BBSs and online services, and I'd play with those things. Wired was talking about cyberspace, and they were talking about it, and they were painting this vision of the future. It was like they were in the future already, and they were speaking to me, and I really wanted to go there. There's one article in the magazine about a guy named Dave Hughes who said, "My life's mission is to hook up the 5.5 billion brains on the planet." I was like, that was an audacious thing to say in 1993, and I just was mesmerized by that idea. There's another article in there by a futurist named Paul Sappho, and I was excited to hear there was a job called futurist. I thought, maybe I'll do that. And Paul said, "Words have been decoupled from paper. In fact, our electronic novelties are transforming the word as profoundly as the printing press did a half millennium ago." So this is pretty heady stuff, and they were painting this future that I just really wanted to be a part of. And I considered myself an entrepreneur at the time, had dabbled in some businesses, and they never really went anywhere, but I thought the internet is where I should be. So what can I do on the internet that would be important and successful? And so I learned everything I could about it. I was downloading files and gophering and arching and all the other things that you old computer nerds will recognize. And I lived in Lincoln. I was in my basement in Lincoln, and I called over a couple friends, and I said, here's what we should do. We should make a video about how to use the internet. Because the internet's going to be huge, but it's kind of hard to use. And who wants to read a book? So let's make a video and teach them how to use it. So these friends, Paul and Eric, happened to be going to the journalism college at UNL, so they were able to borrow a camera and bring it over to my basement one weekend. And we made this video. And when I say, just to be clear, wait for it.
This growth has occurred not only in the number of internet citizens, now estimated between 20 and 50 million worldwide, but also in the number and variety of internet applications, services, and resources available. Of seemingly parallel growth is the amount of information available about the internet and the interest level of the general public and media about it.
Indeed, the internet has finally come of age.
Thank you. Indeed, the internet has finally come of age. So when I say they came over for the weekend, made the video, I don't want to trivialize it. This is a very serious effort. I spent weeks on the script, writing a manual that we were shipping with it, and then editing a couple weeks after editing with, like an editing bay that we rented and was in my basement for a week. And we're in a time pressure, so we were splicing it up, and it's pretty serious endeavor, which is obvious from the production values. But so this was my first internet product, and we packaged that up and we sold it mostly via spam on CompuServe, and it just blew up. There was just millions of copies of that sold. Helped a lot of people getting on the internet. Maybe it didn't, but it's not really important. The important thing was that was my first internet product, and that started my journey to being an internet entrepreneur. And so the many things I learned from that, and from an entrepreneurial sense, one of the most important lessons was to just start. This was my start. Lots of people start with things that don't end up to be important and are potentially embarrassing. But it's important to start, because if you don't start, you're never going to get anywhere. The second lesson from that particular episode is friends are helpful. 15 years ago, I'm in another basement. This one's in San Francisco. This was the office of my first startup in California. There were three of us in the office, in the company. We were working on this product we called Pyra, which was going to be this very cool productivity, collaboration, project management app. And I turned to my friend Paul, the cameraman, also from Nebraska, who came out to California, and I said to Paul, you know what we should do? We should turn that FTP hack you did to make our blog into a product and call it Blogger. As you can see, I said it in Comic Sans, so he didn't know whether or not to take me seriously. But I was serious, as you can see from my face. And to explain what this was, is a very simple hack. And the other reason Paul didn't know whether to take me seriously is because it wasn't much of an idea. He had simply written a script that made it so when we wrote something to our internal blog, and no one had blogs at this time, keep in mind. There were a few people, and we were early on that, but we weren't really working on it as a business. But he had written this little hack that let us check a button when we posted to our internal blog, and it would write it to a file and FTP it to our public web server. And I thought, well, maybe other people would like to use that. The like 100 people in the world who want to publish a blog. So eventually that's what we did. We created this. This is my graphic design, by the way, so I'm pretty proud of that. And the important thing was this worked, and it started to take off, at least a lot more than our other product that was our real product that we were working on, had been working on for a few months. This we built in a week. And it went pretty well, and we started to grow a little bit. Here's some of the rest of the Blogger team: Meg, who's my co-founder, Matt Howie, who you may know from Metafilter, which he still runs for today. That was on a computer under his desk in our office in that basement for a while. And here's Paul and I at South by Southwest 2000, which was the first conference ever to have a panel or anything on blogging, which they probably called weblogging at the time. And I'm using my Palm 7, which was the wireless Palm. You can see the antenna sticking up. And I'm writing on it with a stylus and trying to blog, and we had written an app for it, and basically we had Twitter, come to think of it. But Paul is waiting anxiously to see if the software and the connection works. In this conference, we felt like rock stars. This is 6 months into Blogger, and it was starting to take off, and especially among the South by Southwest crowd, and we were really excited. And Blogger was neat because it simply allowed people, or made it easier. It didn't allow people. It made it easier to publish your thoughts on the web. And note, it didn't make it possible to publish your thoughts on the web. That was possible as long as there was a web, and it was captured in that spirit that Wired magazine wrote about in the early days. And the idea of the democratization of publishing information and millions of voices being out there was always very exciting. But Blogger and tools like it, by making it actually easier to do this thing that people wanted to do, it ushered in millions of new voices into the world. Millions of ideas and stories and silly things, but also really relevant and important things. And so I got excited about that notion, and I dedicated 5 or 6 years of my life to Blogger and the idea of personal expression. And the lessons I took from that, one of the most important one was to make something people want to do easier. And this is really what I've come to think of as the key rule about making not just things for the internet, but products in general. And we focus a lot on innovation, and people sometimes confuse that with helping people do something new. But my rule of thumb is people don't really want to do anything new. They want the same things they've always done. At least the underlying desire to whatever they're doing are the same desires that people have had for millennium, whether it's they want love or recognition, or to impact the world, or to advertise their wares, or these are all things that or they want to create and they want to express themselves. These are all things we are helping them do, but we were just making it easier. And that was very key. The second lesson was to start simply, because Blogger, the first version, was so trivial, we thought maybe that's not even a product. We're working on this very much more complicated product that's probably a lot more valuable, and then we did this little thing. Turned out the little thing was more valuable, and it got more complicated over time, and it got more valuable over time, but it didn't have to be valuable, it didn't have to be complicated when it started. It could start very, very simply. And so that was a key lesson about that. 10 years ago, I'm in Mountain View, California. I find myself at this place, the Google campus. To my surprise, I was an employee of Google at this point. So they bought Blogger in early 1993. And I show up at Google, and it's sort of this miraculous playground for geeks. And they were all really smart and intimidating and went to Ivy League schools, and I come in with my small crew of jokesters who three of the six of us, when we got bought by Google, didn't have degrees, and that may have doubled the number of people in this 1,000-person company that didn't have degrees. And so I felt a little bit like an imposter, but I was also very excited to learn how these people do things. And one of the things that happened at Google was I was at an employee party one time, and I was walking out the doors, and this girl was walking in the doors, and I was like, whoa. And I started following around the party a little bit. And then it wasn't creepy. We both worked there, so it wasn't creepy. And I says to my buddy, watch this. I walk up to her. And this, by the way, is not a thing I ever did before in my life. I would usually just follow her around, and it's like, maybe I can get her email someday. But I walked up to her, and I started talking to her. Well, I walked up to her and stood there until the guy that I knew talking to her introduced me. But then I married her. And so there's a bunch of lessons from Google. I was there a little less than 2 years. I was running Blogger during that time, helping grow it and learn about the Google environment. And they were very supportive. And I eventually left because I felt like it was time to do something new. But while I was there, took away a couple lessons. One is act fast, walk up to the girl. But also, core to Google's philosophy, even on their document they wrote a long time ago about things we believe to be true, one of is fast is better than slow. And that, if you look at what Google does, you notice they are obsessed with speed. And this comes out in how fast their servers return answers. But it comes out in all kinds of things, about lowering the barrier between a person and getting what they want or completing a task. And over time, they've done that more and more. They've brought more information into the search page. They made it so you don't even have to know how to spell anything. They've never expanded beyond their single box on the home page in terms of their search product. And that's similar to this notion of take something people want and make it easier. It's not about, and even Google's very original innovations about working on search, that search wasn't a new thing. They just made it much, much better, made it easier to find the answer you wanted, and made it very, very fast. The other thing I always noted from Google was how big they thought. And this was really eye-opening for me because coming from Blogger and the various basements I had spent most of my time in, working up until then, it was so cool to see at Google how big they thought. And when we got there, our minds were blown about walking around saying, oh, you're scanning books here. Oh, you're scanning all the books in the universe. Okay. Oh, you got this video thing, and you're going to download all the videos, and you're flying cars. I'm not supposed to mention the flying cars, but they were just doing these really audacious things. And every time you talk to Larry and Sergey in these meetings, you'd have like, here's our plans, very tractable, very sensible, and like, why don't you do this crazy, unreasonable thing instead? And like, maybe we should do this crazy, unreasonable thing. That's the brilliance of those guys is they're just crazy, unreasonable things. And I had come from a world where it was like really just trying to pay the rent. And it's hard to think about doing crazy, unreasonable things when you're in that mode. But I think even if you are in that mode, even if you're not Google, you can think really, really big as long as you remember to start small. 5 years ago, where was I 5 years ago? Oh, I was in Chicago. Almost to this day, 5 years ago, I was in Chicago. It was very early in the morning. I was in a hotel room, and I wake up, and I shower, and I put on dirty socks. and I tweet. And I get to this TV studio, and I'm really nervous, and I go to the bathroom. They're waiting for me to get on stage, and I walk out of the bathroom, and I trip in the hallway on my face. And then I sit down beside Oprah and talk about Twitter, and she tweets. But But when she tweeted, she typed that in, and she hit the F1 key. This is on a Windows machine, and because the F1 key wasn't her fault, it had a yellow piece of tape on it, so it looked like the thing you should hit. And she hit the F1 key, and which of course refreshed the browser, and the tweet went away. And this is live television, and I see this happening, and we cut to commercial. And I don't know if I remembered the tweet or someone told me or I changed it, but I typed that in and hit send. Nobody noticed. So that was fun. We had 400,000 people signed up for Twitter that day, which was a pretty big day. Today, that wouldn't be considered a big day. But this was 5 years ago, 2009. That was kind of in the most crazy period. And so that was just one tiny anecdote from a very wild ride of Twitter. And it was, Twitter, there's all kinds of lessons from. This is a slide I actually took from a presentation I gave in 2010. Yeah. So Twitter is the number 2 thing people didn't get at that time. Twitter was kind of weird, right? It was like no one, I think it's probably still on this list, but even though 250 million people use it on a regular basis, it was kind of a weird product. But when I think back what it actually did, it really did the same thing. It took something people wanted to do and it made it easier. A lot of those things were the same things people wanted to do with blogs. They want to express themselves, they want to put ideas out there, they want to share information, they want to get information, they want to find out what's happening, they want to connect with other people and have conversations. These are all pretty universal desires. And what I realized what Twitter did, at first we thought the novelty was really about the SMS, which is what we started Twitter on, but was never a primary use case. And then, but from SMS, we came onto this idea of this very constrained format. And the combination of the constrained format and a lot of the affordances we created with the UI, and then today with the ubiquity of smartphones and the mobile apps, they made these things that people have always done much, much easier and faster. So that was a reinforcement of that lesson. Another lesson was about being open. And the reason I mention this, Twitter is open in many ways. In the first few years, we had this, we had a lot of developers and a lot of API openness that people took advantage of. And I think ultimately a lot of that was the wrong idea, but the other way we're open, and I've learned this many times, is be open to what your creation might become. And it's important to have a vision, but I found that visions emerge over time. They don't have to come fully baked in this when you start something. In fact, with Blogger, it was really, with the way we described Blogger at first is an easy way to update your homepage. It was nothing highfalutin. It was nothing about the democratization of publishing, and it became much bigger in our minds. And Twitter was thought of initially as sharing the status or what you're doing to friends and family and coworkers. That's literally something like that is what our homepage said for years. And then it occurred to us, that's really a subset of it. We see all these miraculous applications from, of course, the famous protests and revolutions that have been where Twitter's been used as a communication tool, to everyday broadcast and information and news, to being of use in emergencies and crises. And part of the reason, part of the way you help a vision emerge over time, I've learned, is by leaving room for use cases that you don't anticipate. And this also goes back to Blogger, and because the definition of a weblog in 1999, which is the term that everybody used, was a log of websites you'd been to. And the only weblogging tools that existed that I was familiar with had 3 fields: title, URL, description. And so that's what you would do. Is like, oh, I went to this site. It was about this. I liked it. It had cats. And with Blogger, we were like, let's just make one big text area. And that completely opened up. People could still do weblogging in a traditional sense, but it actually became a publishing format that had an infinite variety of uses, which is how we think of blogging today. Twitter was thought of as a status sharing tool, but Facebook had status at the time, and we were in college, so we didn't see Facebook right then. But it existed, and so Facebook had status you could add to your page, and if you remember, the way it was displayed would be Evan Williams is, and then you type in your status. So it's much more literal. Okay, that makes it easy to know what I type in that box, because apparently I'm saying what I am doing or thinking or whatever. And so that was more straightforward. Twitter, we thought of as status, but we didn't put the word is. And it turned out it doesn't have to be status. It could be there's a fire across the street. It could be a joke, lots of jokes. So eventually we came to think of Twitter as this much more broad thing, and we were open to that vision emerging. The second lesson, of course, from Twitter is don't forget to pack socks. I got fresh socks today. So that brings us to today. I'm less convinced than I was in 1994 that the internet has truly come of age. I think it's more complicated now. I used to be much more idealistic, not more idealistic, I'm still very idealistic, but I was much more utopian about where all this stuff would take us. And the idea that anyone could share information, anyone could publish, I thought was going to automatically lead the world to a better place. And I think there's lots of evidence that tons of good stuff has happened because of these technologies, specifically technologies that let people share globally. And the emphasis of most of my career has been in lowering that barrier, making it easier for people to put thoughts out there and share what they thought was important. And so when I left Twitter a couple years ago as CEO, I immediately thought, I got to create another publishing platform because I still have all these ideas. I have all these ideas that even date back to Blogger times, and then I put it off for a while because I thought, well, my mind must be stuck in a rut because I can only think about helping people type in boxes and hit publish. But I came back to it, and I started a new company called Medium a couple years ago. Oh, thanks. Medium is another publishing platform like Twitter and Blogger, but it has a slightly different goal. Whereas the goal for those was really about let's lower the barrier and make it easier for more people to have a voice. I think the internet has basically done that, not just those tools, but many others. We've gotten pretty darn good at enabling the possibility of sharing something with the world, or whichever part of the world wants it. And not everybody, not quite 5.5 billion brains, or the 7 billion that exist today, are connected, and there are people working on that, and that will eventually be the case. But of those that are connected, it can't really get any easier to share ideas or thoughts or pictures. And but I think there's still a lot more to do, because that's sort of step one. And the questions we're asking with Medium is, what else can we do? How do we tackle some of these other challenges, like the fact that there's just too much information out there, and how do we make sense of it? And the trends of too much information and the way we've organized the internet has really meant that there's just more and more stuff added all the time on the top of these reverse chronological streams. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people are getting the right information or the most meaningful or valuable information to them. It's very based on newness and quickness, and there's value in that. And I'm still very much on board with what Twitter enables. But with Medium, we wanted to do something different. So we're trying to create a platform that allows people still to share stories and ideas more easily than they could otherwise if they're more than 140 characters and people have something bigger to say. And we're taking out a lot of the complications to doing that exists with blogs or other platforms. And we're making it easy to look beautiful and streamline writing experience. And then the other goal is to help the very best stories and ideas reach the right audience, or as big of an audience as possible. So that's what Medium is. I'm loving that. Love the team. The product is coming together, and really just in heads down company mode, doing it again, which is fun. The other thing that's going on today is I got these guys. Thanks. That was the gratuitous cute kid picture is always a winner. So the girl from Google, Sarah, and little Owen and young Captain America, Miles, are at home, and they relate to one of my more recent key learning from this recent phase. One of which is keep going. So I want to keep doing this stuff because there's always more to learn, and there's more to build. And like I said, the internet has not truly come of age yet. There's just so much more we can do to move things forward. And it seems important to do that stuff. And one of my mottos is there's always another level. There's always another level of learning and mastery and relationships you can build. And now's a fun time to just be playing and pushing and doing new things. The second thing is to stay balanced. So those guys at home and more awareness in general has led me to approach life and work in a much more balanced way than I ever have. I still work hard. I think I get more done than I did in my 20s when I was working a blogger and sleeping in that basement half the time and eating the whatever was in the vending machine to survive. That wasn't, there's some romance to that, and if you're a young entrepreneur and you're doing that and your passion is driving you, that's awesome. Sometimes what you lack in experience or wisdom, you have to make up for in brute force. But it is, I think I would have been much more effective had I focused more on balance earlier in my life, and so I really encourage that. And loving life today, and happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Give it up. Give it up for Evan Williams. Yes. Give it up for Evan Williams. Evan, if you're cool, we're going to take a few questions. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, let's do it.
Great. If you have a question, stand up to the microphone. We have time for a few questions. I'll start with the first question for you, Evan. You mentioned during your talk having to shift from that mindset of just paying the bills, and you encounter that Google culture of thinking really, really big. What allowed you to make that transition from, again, just getting by to thinking a lot bigger? Was it just a matter of the people that you spent your time with and the environment?
That was the biggest thing. Yeah, being in that environment where that was just the culture of how they thought was very inspiring. And I mean, also, it didn't help that I no longer had to worry about paying the bills. I mean, that's the reality of it that I want to acknowledge is when you have to pay the bills, you have to pay the bills, and you can't ignore that. And that was in the mode. When my company got bought by Google, it was an all-stock deal, and Google was a private company, which turned out to be lucky. But I had to get an advance on my salary to buy a car to drive to Google.
Wow.
And no one on my team had a car. Well, 4 people who lived in the city didn't, so I drove them to work every day as well. So I definitely, like, just getting there and actually getting a paycheck was pretty miraculous and relieved a lot of the stress. But secondly, it was really the way they think there and being around those people that was great. And that's one of the beauties of, an event like this and the spirit that's going on in the Bay Area and really all across the world right now with technology and entrepreneurship. I think enforces that idea of thinking big, hopefully. And so I think this is great that you have an event like this to encourage that.
Great. Let's take a question right over here.
So you talked about how you don't always know what the customers are going to do with your product and what the users will do. Of all the things that have been done with the various products you've developed over the years, what surprised you the most?
Oh, geez. It's probably would be the guess, but the Arab Spring stuff, the fact that people are really using our products in Egypt and Tunisia and Iran to organize in ways that and to go out to the streets and to protest what was going on in their countries and with their governments was definitely surprising. That was, I mean, it actually a few weeks after being on Oprah is when we were going to schedule a maintenance window for Twitter, and we get a call from the State Department that says maybe you should put that off, and that was like, wow, that was not anticipated. It's not like it never occurred to us, even from Blogger. We had these heady ideas of, really democratization. In the most literal sense, but to see that happening was really pretty crazy.
And Evan, was that one of those rare moments, I think I read in Biz Stone's book, when the State Department reached out to you, you actually made a decision as a company not to get involved in the politics, and you went through with the update that was supposed to happen?
We didn't want to get involved in the politics, and because we didn't know enough. And this was really smart of Biz to drive our philosophy on this. We did end up moving the maintenance window, but throughout all of that, we never wanted to take sides because we didn't know if these are good things or bad things. We didn't want to claim that we were driving this important change in the world. Maybe it was all going to end poorly. We weren't experts on that. What we did believe was important was the free flow of information. And so we always wanted to support that. And so, and even today, I used to get asked about that stuff all the time, and I usually avoid talking about it because I just don't know enough about it. And that's why, as a company, we also didn't want to look, we always wanted to be a global platform, so we didn't want to look like we were in the pocket of the State Department or anything else, even though we were based in the U.S. It was very important that we were open and global and neutral.
So you have a pretty good track record, and I'm sure you have a...
Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm sure you have a lot of ideas all the time. What's your process for choosing what to work on and validating that it's a real problem worth solving?
Good question. So, actually, I was talking to my brother last night about what I should talk about up here, my brother who's here, and he reminded me that focus used to be my main problem. I had way too many ideas, and my first company, when I was kind of wrapping it up and nothing ever really worked well in that company, I counted over the last year, I had worked on 32 different projects or ideas that I thought were going to go somewhere, which is too many. And so now I'm a lot more discerning. Obviously, I think of any idea that I'm personally going to pursue myself, I need to be very passionate about it. And one of the lessons that I didn't talk about because it didn't fit neatly into the 2015 10 or 5 mile markers was Odeo, which is a company I built where I made a mistake of investing in a project and doing a project that I wasn't personally passionate about in terms of, I thought it was a good idea, and I got all this external validation why it was a good idea, and I was asked to launch it and announce it at the TED conference, and I kind of got sucked into it, but I was never passionately a user, and it was very different than Blogger, which I'd done before, where I was working on that because I just wanted it. I mean, literally, we created it for ourselves and then made it a product, and then most of the product decisions came from our own gut. So that's the number one thing that I always tell people is build something that you want to use ideally, or at least want to exist in the world. And my rule for investing in anything is that I have to want this to exist in the world. I have to not, so it's a similar rule, just say, if this was successful and I had nothing and I was not involved and I got no money off it or would I want it to do well? And that's a great check, I think, to know if you really feel good about the idea and can be passionate about it.
Thanks.
Right across this way.
Landon Young here. Thank you for your personal stories. As an educator and an entrepreneur, I have students who look at you as a mentor, as a role model that they hope to aspire to. Can they really have balance in their starving young entrepreneur lives?
There's a spectrum of balance, I would say. I think what Dario talked about yesterday, I think is important for anyone at any stage of their career. And there's just science to back that up, that you're not going to think as well and you're not going to work as well. I mean, if you do this sort of work, your job is to think and be creative. And it's also lots of blocking and tackling and getting stuff done, which you can do and answering email all through the night. But the really important stuff comes from the insights and those, it's been well proven, and I've experienced myself, come much more often if you do basic things like get a reasonable amount of sleep, move your body around. I meditate regularly now, which I find incredibly helpful as a driver of both deeper thought and creativity, and even relationship building, which is critical no matter what stage you're in as well. So you could work 16 hours a day or 14 hours a day might be a good idea if you have that sort of stamina. But if you start cutting out those basic things, you're just asking for decreasing returns. And I think you might get more done in a day, maybe a week, probably not a month, and certainly not a year.